The question of Crimea returning to Ukraine has once again sent shockwaves across the world, reigniting one of the most complex and emotionally charged geopolitical disputes of the modern era. Crimea, a strategically vital peninsula in the Black Sea, has been at the center of global tension since 2014, when Russia annexed it following a controversial referendum that was widely rejected by Ukraine and the international community. Now, as the war between Russia and Ukraine continues to reshape global politics, energy markets, military alliances, and public opinion, the idea of Crimea returning to Ukrainian control has moved from a distant possibility to a serious topic of discussion among diplomats, analysts, and military planners. For Russia, this prospect represents not just a territorial loss, but a symbolic, strategic, and psychological blow that challenges its narrative of strength and historical destiny. From Ukraine's perspective, Crimea has never stopped being Ukrainian territory. Kiev has consistently stated that any peace settlement that does not include the return of Crimea is unacceptable. Ukrainian leaders argue that allowing Russia to keep Crimea would reward aggression, undermine international law, and set a dangerous precedent for future conflicts around the world. As Ukraine has gained battlefield confidence and international military support, the discussion has shifted from whether Ukraine can survive as a state to whether it can fully restore its territorial integrity. The idea that Crimea could one day be back under Ukrainian control has therefore become both a rallying cry for Ukrainians and a source of deep anxiety for the Kremlin. In Moscow, the reaction to such discussions has ranged from outright denial to angry warnings. Russian officials repeatedly insist that Crimea is Russian forever, framing the peninsula as an inseparable part of the Russian Federation. Russian state media portrays any suggestion of Crimea returning to Ukraine as Western propaganda or psychological warfare designed to weaken Russian morale. However, behind this confident rhetoric lies clear concern. Crimea is not just another region for Russia. It holds enormous military value, hosting the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol, and serves as a gateway for projecting Russian power into the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and North Africa. Losing Crimea would significantly reduce Russia's naval reach and undermine its long-term strategic posture. The psychological impact on Russia would be equally severe. Since 2014, Crimea has been used as a symbol of Russia's resurgence and defiance of Western influence. President Vladimir Putin's popularity surged after the annexation, with many Russians viewing it as the correction of a historical injustice following the collapse of the Soviet Union. If Crimea were to return to Ukraine, it would challenge the legitimacy of that narrative and raise uncomfortable questions inside Russia about the cost of war, sanctions, and isolation. It could also embolden domestic critics and expose cracks in the image of state control carefully maintained by the Kremlin. Ukraine, on the other hand, sees the return of Crimea as essential not only for sovereignty, but also for long-term security. As long as Russia controls Crimea, Ukraine remains vulnerable to naval blockades, missile attacks, and constant military pressure in the south. Ukrainian officials argue that Crimea has been turned into a massive military base, from which Russia can threaten Ukrainian cities and infrastructure. Regaining Crimea would significantly improve Ukraine's defensive position and reduce the likelihood of future aggression. It would also serve as a powerful message that borders cannot be changed by force in the 21st century. The international reaction to the possibility of Crimea returning to Ukraine has been mixed, cautious, and often carefully worded. Western countries, particularly the United States and members of the European Union, officially recognize Crimea as part of Ukraine and have never accepted its annexation. Many Western leaders publicly support Ukraine's territorial integrity, including Crimea, but behind closed doors there is concern about escalation. The idea of Ukraine attempting to retake Crimea militarily raises fears of a wider war, especially given Russia's nuclear capabilities. Some Western analysts warn that Crimea represents a red line for Moscow and that a direct threat to Russian control there could provoke unpredictable responses. At the same time, there is growing recognition in the West that freezing the conflict without addressing Crimea could lead to long-term instability. A peace deal that leaves Crimea under Russian control might reduce fighting temporarily, but would likely fail to deliver lasting security. It could encourage future acts of aggression, not only by Russia, but by other states watching how the international community responds. As a result, the conversation has shifted from whether Crimea should be part of negotiations to how its status can be resolved without triggering catastrophic escalation. European countries have their own unique perspectives, shaped by geography, history, and energy dependence. Eastern European nations, particularly Poland and the Baltic states, strongly support Ukraine's claim to Crimea. Having experienced Russian influence and pressure themselves, they view any compromise over Crimea as dangerous appeasement. These countries argue that Russia only understands strength and that clear consequences are necessary to deter future aggression. Western European states, such as Germany and France, tend to emphasize diplomacy and risk management, balancing support for Ukraine with concerns about economic fallout and regional stability. Beyond Europe, global reactions reveal the shifting balance of power in a multipolar world. China has largely avoided taking a clear position on Crimea, calling instead for dialogue and peaceful resolution. Beijing emphasizes respect for territorial integrity, while simultaneously opposing Western sanctions and NATO expansion. This ambiguity allows China to maintain relations with both Russia and Ukraine, while positioning itself as a potential mediator. Other countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America often view the Crimea issue through the lens of their own historical experiences with colonialism, sovereignty, and Western intervention. Some are sympathetic to Ukraine's legal claims, while others are wary of what they see as selective enforcement of international norms. The role of international law is central to the Crimea debate. Under international law, Crimea is widely recognized as Ukrainian territory, and Russia's annexation is considered illegal by most of the world. The United Nations General Assembly has passed multiple resolutions affirming Ukraine's territorial integrity. However, international law lacks strong enforcement mechanisms, especially when major powers are involved. The Crimea situation highlights the gap between legal principles and geopolitical realities, raising questions about the effectiveness of the international system in preventing and resolving conflicts. For the people of Crimea themselves, the situation is deeply complex. Since 2014, the peninsula has undergone significant changes in administration, infrastructure, and demographics. Russian authorities have invested heavily in projects such as the Crimean Bridge, linking the region to mainland Russia. At the same time, reports of human rights abuses, particularly against Crimean Tatars and pro-Ukrainian activists, have drawn international criticism. The voices of ordinary Crimeans are often overshadowed by the geopolitical struggle, yet their future remains one of the most sensitive aspects of any potential resolution. The Crimean Tatars, an indigenous Muslim population with a history of repression under Soviet rule, overwhelmingly opposed the annexation. Many have faced arrests, harassment, and restrictions on cultural and political expression under Russian control. Ukraine and international human rights organizations argue that returning Crimea to Ukraine would help protect minority rights and restore freedoms. Russia, meanwhile, denies systematic abuses and claims to have improved living standards on the peninsula. This clash of narratives further complicates efforts to build trust or find common ground. Militarily, the question of Crimea is one of the most dangerous aspects of the conflict. Russia has heavily fortified the peninsula, deploying advanced air defense systems, naval assets, and missile capabilities. Any attempt to retake Crimea by force would be extremely challenging and costly. Ukrainian officials acknowledge these difficulties but argue that modern warfare, precision strikes, and sustained pressure could gradually make Russian control untenable. Recent attacks on Russian military installations in Crimea have already demonstrated that the peninsula is not as secure as Moscow once believed. These developments have rattled Russian society. While state media downplays such incidents, social media and independent channels reveal growing unease among Russians, particularly those with family members in the military. The idea that Crimea could be vulnerable undermines the perception of Russian invincibility. It also raises fears about what a defeat there would mean for Russia's global standing. For a country that has invested so much prestige in holding Crimea, losing it would be a historic setback. The economic dimension cannot be ignored. Crimea has been under heavy sanctions since 2014, limiting investment, tourism, and international trade. Ukraine argues that reintegration would allow Crimea to reconnect with global markets and benefit from post-war reconstruction efforts. Russia, however, has spent billions subsidizing the region, and losing it would represent not only a political defeat, but also a financial loss. Sanctions related to Crimea have also become a broader tool of pressure on Russia, signaling long-term consequences for territorial aggression. Public opinion around the world reflects both sympathy for Ukraine and fear of escalation. Many people support Ukraine's right to reclaim its territory, including Crimea, but worry about the human cost of prolonged war. The potential for nuclear escalation, even if remote, weighs heavily on global consciousness. This tension between justice and stability lies at the heart of the international debate over Crimea's future. As the conflict continues, the fate of Crimea remains uncertain. It could become a subject of future negotiations, a frozen conflict, or the focus of renewed fighting. What is clear is that Crimea is far more than a piece of land. It represents competing visions of world order, sovereignty, and power. For Ukraine, it is about restoring national dignity and security. For Russia, it is about identity, influence, and resistance to what it perceives as Western dominance. For the world, it is a test of whether international norms still matter in an era of great power rivalry. The possibility of Crimea returning to Ukraine may shock Russia, but it also forces the international community to confront difficult questions. Can aggression truly be reversed? Can diplomacy succeed where war has failed? And what kind of global system will emerge from this conflict? The answers to these questions will shape not only the future of Crimea, but the future of international relations for years to come.